On November 26, 1888, Constable Thomas Bower entered room number 13 of a boarding house on Miller's Court and locked the door from the inside. 40 seconds later, he opened it again and stepped outside. The report states that he did not shout. He simply stood against the wall, lowered his hand with the lantern to the paving stones, and remained there until Inspector Frederick George Aberline arrived. Witnesses claim the constable didn't utter a single word for the next 2 hours. Aberline's report of November 27, 1888 was removed from Scotland Yard's operational archive the day after it was submitted. The official reason given was that the material failed to pass the verification process. According to the closed wing registry, the report was classified as documents of particular sensitivity not subject to public review, until its partial declassification in 1976. 87 of the 114 pages were returned with paragraphs redacted. 27 pages are listed in the register as lost during the transfer of the archive. Among the returned pages were records that no official historian had ever included in any of the public versions of the case. What follows is reconstructed from these records. The first bodies appeared in late August of 1888. The Metropolitan Police accepted the reports as routine Whitechapel crime news, where violent death was so commonplace that inspectors recorded it in their registers with the same intonation with which a merchant recorded his expenses. By that time, the East End was a cluster of slums populated by what the police officially described as a socially precarious population. Murders in such neighborhoods rarely became the subject of lengthy investigations. Everything changed on August 31, 1888, when Carter Charles Cross discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols in Bucks Row at 3:30 in the morning. Aberline, who was 46 at the time and had over 20 years of operational experience under his belt, arrived on the scene at 15 minutes past 4. In his report, he recorded the following. The woman was lying on her back, her throat slit twice, her abdomen open. Scotland Yard's duty surgeon, Dr. Llewellyn, initially classified the injuries as those inflicted by a short, well-sharpened instrument with a thin blade and recommended considering the theory that the killer had received surgical training. Aberline disagreed with this assessment from the outset, but did not record his disagreement in the official report. The discrepancy only appears in his personal operational notes, which were included as an appendix to the seized report. The cuts on the throat do not have the sawing quality typical of a scalpel. The blade entered and exited at an angle unusual for a surgical instrument. The width of the cut at the initial point is significantly greater than the width at the final point. A blade with a double edge and tapering toward the tip leaves a similar profile. In the European forensic tradition, this profile has been described in the context of ritual knives of Middle Eastern origin. The second victim, Annie Chapman, was found on September 8, 1888, in the courtyard of 29 Hanbury Street at 6 in the morning. The distance from the scene of Nichols's death was 400 yards. The autopsy was performed by Dr. George Baxter Phillips. The official report included information about a slit throat and an open abdominal cavity. The official report did not include the following. Annie Chapman's uterus was missing. It was not damaged or displaced within the body. It was carefully removed through an incision in the abdominal wall and removed from the crime scene. Dr. Phillips insisted that this fact not be mentioned in the materials released to the press. The official reason was to avoid public panic. Unofficially, as recorded in Aberline's notes, the surgeon was amazed by the level of anatomical precision with which the organ was removed. According to Phillips, a similar extraction would have taken a skilled surgeon at least 15 minutes in an operating room. The killer, based on the victim's body temperature and witness statements, estimated that he had no more than 4 or 5 minutes to kill. By this point, Aberline had 2 bodies with identical wound patterns and 1 removed organ. Little did he know, that was only the beginning of the list. The third and fourth victims, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were discovered on the same night, September 30th, 1888. A double murder in one night meant the killer was operating under a tight schedule. Edo's left kidney was removed. Nothing was recovered from Stride's body, a fact Abeline later explained. The killer had been interrupted and retreated without completing the procedure. It was on this night that the inspector first posed in his notes a question he couldn't ask out loud within the walls of Scotland Yard. What purpose does one person serve in the womb of one woman and the kidney of another? The answer came later. When he arrived, Abeline wrote it down without a single comment, in a single dry sentence that remains on page 32 of the seized report. Presumably, organs are not removed for study or to conceal evidence. They are removed for use. A map of London was brought into Abeline's office by Lance Constable Walter Andrews on the morning of October 2, 1888. It was a standard Office of Public Works city map, printed in 1885 at a scale of 1 inch to 1 mile. Abeline had asked for it to be brought in the evening before, immediately after all the measurements had been taken at the site of Catherine Edo's death. He had instructed Andrews to mark all 4 confirmed body locations on the map with pins and draw strings between them. Yes, strings, not pencil lines. Abeline wanted to see geometry in volume, not on a plane. Andrews completed the task and left the map on the table. He himself did not record his impressions of what he saw anywhere. But Abeline's report retained an indirect reference to the constable leaving the office quickly and not returning to the inspector's office that day. Abeline stared at the map for about 40 minutes before picking up a ruler. The 4 locations formed a non-chaotic cluster typical of serial murders committed by proximity and convenience. Bucks Row, Hanbury Street, Burner Street, Mitre Square. The distances between the points, when connected by straight lines, yielded 4 sides of a figure whose deviation from a regular geometric polygon was less than 3%. This was too precise to be random. It was too precise even to be intentional, unless the perpetrator was working from a prearranged plan with coordinates marked on it. Abeline wrote the following in his notes. The 4 points form a regular polygon with its center at the intersection of Commercial Road and Lemon Street. The deviation from symmetry is minimal and cannot be explained by either a random selection of victims or a random selection of locations. The killer is tied to specific addresses. The addresses were chosen before the murders, not after. He didn't write down what this geometry meant then, probably because he didn't know yet. But what he did was this. He put down his ruler, picked up a compass, and drew a circle circumscribed around the quadrilateral. The center of the circle fell precisely on the intersection he'd calculated. The radius was just under a half a mile. Within this circle were several dozen streets. Abeline circled it in pencil and wrote a single letter inside. N, which in his personal notation stood for observation. From that moment on, the task force received unspoken patrol priority in the designated area. The next 3 weeks were quiet. This in itself was an anomaly. The average killer had never taken a break longer than 3 weeks before. October 1888 passed without any new bodies. Some Scotland Yard analysts interpreted the pause as a sign that the criminal had either left the city or was dead. Abeline didn't believe this theory and recorded his disagreement in writing. A pause doesn't mean a stop. A pause means preparation. If the geometry is correct, the final point hasn't been reached yet. On November 9th, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly was murdered. She was found on Miller's Court, indoors, unlike all the previous victims. The extent of the anatomical damage was so extensive that official identification of the body was made solely by the ears and eyes, as her face was completely destroyed. Dr. Thomas Bond, who performed the autopsy, noted in his report that the victim's heart was missing. It had been removed. Abeline returned to the map that same day at 8 o'clock in the evening. He marked the 5th dot, Miller's Court, Dorset Street. Then he took a compass and ruler. The 5th dot didn't simply complete the quadrangle. The fifth dot, connected to the four previous ones, transformed the entire figure into something fundamentally different. He worked with the mat non-stop for about 2 hours. The notes from this evening are written more unevenly than usual, which, for Aberline, whose handwriting was distinguished by clerical neatness throughout his career, is in itself an aberration. 5 dots. Pentagon. When connecting each point with two non-adjacent points, a 5-pointed star is formed. The geometry is impeccable. The error does not exceed 2%. A similar figure in European occult tradition is known as a pentagram and is used as a symbol of invocation or protection. The figure's center is on an undeveloped area on the east bank of the Thames, in the Wapping area. There's not a single word of comment below this entry. The next entry was made the following day and begins with a different topic. But between these two entries in the manuscript, there's a detail that archivists noted separately in the accompanying sheet when declassifying it. The last paragraph of the entry from November 9th is circled in pencil 3 times. A circular outline, thick, pressed into the paper. The person who made it understood something. What exactly he realized isn't stated in the text, but what he did next speaks for itself. The following morning, Aberline sent a formal request to the Office of Public Works Mapping Department, asking for a detailed map of the undeveloped land and buildings in the Wapping area along the east bank of the Thames. The request was registered. According to the archive register, a response was received 4 days later. He simultaneously sent a second request. This request was not recorded in the official Scotland Yard logs. It was identified only by its mention in Aberline's report itself. The request was sent to the British Museum, to the Department of Oriental Antiquities, to a specific employee whose name was redacted from the declassified pages. Aberline described the content of the request in one sentence. I requested information on symbolic systems in which pentagonal geometry is used as the basis for ritual actions involving the removal and use of human organs. The British Museum's response came quickly, much faster than it would have been under normal office procedures. Aberline didn't describe the content of this response in his report, but his next operational note, dated November 12, 1888, begins with the word Babylon. An employee of the Oriental Antiquities Department of the British Museum, whose name is redacted from all surviving copies of the report, arrived at Scotland Yard at 10:30 in the morning on November 13, 1888. He brought with him a leather satchel from which he removed 3 items: photographic copies of cuneiform tablets from the museum's collection, a handwritten translation of fragments into English, and a sheet of thick paper folded in 4 with a hand-drawn drawing. Aberline described the drawing as a diagram depicting a disassembled human body with captions in a language the guest identified as Akkadian. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Aberline took notes throughout the conversation. The visitor from the British Museum began by placing before the inspector a photographic copy of a tablet dating from approximately the 18th century BC and originating from excavations in the area of ancient Nippur. The tablet belonged to a corpus of texts known in academic circles as the Sumerian List of Spells and was long considered a mundane magical text. The guest explained that this classification was erroneous. The tablet's text provided step-by-step instructions for creating an artificial body suitable for the inhabitation of a lower-order infernal spirit. The Akkadian term for this creature has no exact Russian equivalent, Aberline recorded the visitor's words. The closest translation is one who is assembled from the dead. In Western European tradition, this concept was later reworked into the notion of the Golem, but the Babylonian original is significantly older and far more precise in its technical requirements. The technical requirements occupied most of the tablet. These were precisely the organs that interested Aberline. According to the text, the body for a spirit's inhabitation could not be composed arbitrarily. Each organ performed a strictly defined function in what the tablet described as the mechanics of animation. The heart served as the source of the primal impulse. Without it, The assembled body remained inert, regardless of the quality of the ritual performed. The kidneys, according to the text, performed a function that the Akkadian author described with a term literally translated as purification from earthly things. A visitor from the British Museum explained that the issue was about neutralizing what the ancient Babylonians considered the sin of incarnation, that is, the set of biological properties that bind a living being to mortal nature. Without this neutralization, the spirit infused into the body would immediately reject the material vessel. The third organ on the list was designated by a term the guest translated with obvious difficulty. He paused before the word, paused for a few seconds, and then said, "A vessel for dark energy." In his explanation, he indicated that he was talking about an organ specifically associated with female physiology and perceived in the Babylonian occult tradition as an anatomical point in which the vital force capable of generating a new being is concentrated. That's why, he said, all the victims described in the text were women. The text explicitly stated this as a mandatory requirement, not an arbitrary choice. Aberline wrote down this part without a single added word, only the facts relayed by the guest. Then the guest unfolded the sheet of paper with the drawing. The diagram depicted a human silhouette, divided into labeled zones. Next to each zone was a number. Aberline asked what the numbers meant. The guest replied that they were seizure numbers. The sign prescribed a strict sequence. Violating the order rendered everything that had gone before useless and required the procedure to be started over. The inspector asked the guest to name the complete list of organs in the order they would be removed. The guest did. Aberline compared the list with his operational notes for all 5 victims. The match was complete. Annie Chapman's uterus was second on the list. Catherine Eddowes' kidney was third. Mary Jane Kelly's heart was fifth. He didn't record how many positions remained unfilled on the list, but he recorded something else. Before leaving, the visitor from the British Museum reported the following. According to the tablet's text, the full list contained 7 items. Aberline had already identified 5 of them from existing victims. This meant the ritual was incomplete. This meant the performer needed 2 more victims. The guest clarified, Aberline wrote, that the tablet's text did not specify a time limit between sacrifices. However, it did state the following. Each organ remains fit for the ritual for no more than 48 hours from the time of removal. After this period, the removed material loses, according to the text, its dark warmth and becomes unusable. This means that all 7 extractions must have been made in one continuous cycle, or that the performer has a method of preserving the extracted material unknown to modern medical science. Aberline stopped here and moved on to the next paragraph of notes. In this next paragraph, he recorded the question he asked his guest at the very end of the meeting. The question was, what would happen if the ritual was successfully completed? Aberline recorded the British Museum guest's answer verbatim and without any abbreviations. This is the only place in the report where the inspector quotes someone else's speech in full rather than paraphrasing it. According to the tablet's text and accompanying commentary found in the same Nippur archive, the completed ritual creates a physical body suitable for existence in the material world. The spirit inhabiting this body is not human. It is a being that Babylonian tradition classifies as infernal, that is, originating from a realm the text describes as beyond the living world. Such a creature does not experience pain in the physiological sense, since its nervous system does not perform the evolutionary function of self-preservation. It does not require food or water in the usual sense. Its physical strength far exceeds that of the human body, as it is not limited by muscle fatigue or pain. The only known way to neutralize it, according to the text, is to destroy the summoning seal applied to the body during the ritual. Without this seal, the spirit loses its connection with the material vessel and returns to the realm from which it was summoned. The visitor from the British Museum left. Aberline remained alone in the office. The next entry is dated the same day, but 3 hours later. It is short. The inspector recorded that he had made a request to the chief of operations for an increase in patrols in Whitechapel and the surrounding areas, as well as for the issue of 12 additional firearms to constables engaged in surveillance. The request was partially granted. Additional patrol personnel were assigned. Additional weapons were denied due to budgetary concerns. 2 paragraphs later, Aberline recorded that same night, an unlocked container containing samples taken from the scene of Mary Jane Kelly's death was discovered in the Scotland Yard morgue. The container was empty. The samples were missing. The locks on the morgue doors had not been forced. The symbols on the walls were not immediately discovered. The first to see them was Constable Henry Holland, who was on duty on Hanbury Street on the night of September 8th to 9th, 1888, the same night that Annie Chapman was murdered. Holland recorded the following in his report. On the brickwork of the wall of the house opposite the gateway where the body was found, there were streaks of a dark substance, similar in appearance to blood, forming an angular pattern. At the time, Holland dismissed what he saw as random footprints left by the killer as he retreated. His report was filed and not reread for 2 months. Aberline returned to Holland's report on November 14, 1888, the day after his meeting with the British Museum guest. By then, the gateway on Hanbury Street had been washed clean by rain and several waves of street cleaners. The symbols vanished from the masonry without a trace. Aberline requested reports from all the constables on duty near the locations where the remaining 4 bodies were found. The request took 3 days to complete. Of the 4 reports he eventually received, 3 constables mentioned similar streaks or scratches on the walls. All 3 classified what they saw as insignificant and did not take photographs. The 4th report, compiled at the scene of Mary Jane Kelly's death on Miller's Court, contained one exception. Constable Walter Beck, who was on duty at the entrance to the boarding house on the night of November 9th, recorded the following. Inside room number 13, on the wall above the bed, there were markings made with a dark red substance. Beck described them as letters of an unknown alphabet, arranged in 3 horizontal rows. He added one detail which he considered unimportant and therefore bracketed at the end of the report. The signs were more visible in the dark than by flashlight. Aberline immediately requested a verbal explanation from Beck. The constable confirmed that when he entered the room with a lit lantern, the markings were barely visible against the dark masonry. When the lantern was accidentally covered with a coat while being carried and the room became completely dark, the markings became more distinct. They weren't glowing in the traditional sense, Beck clarified. They seemed slightly less dark than the surrounding masonry, as if they absorbed the darkness in a different way than the stone. Aberline returned to Miller's Court that same day. The room had already been cleaned by then, on orders from the landlord, John McCarthy, who was eager to rent the premises out again. The wall had been whitewashed. Aberline examined it in daylight, then asked that the shutters be closed. In the darkness, the wall appeared uniform. The symbols disappeared completely under the lime. He then resorted to a method he later described in his report as accidentally discovered during the inspection of the scene of Mary Jane Kelly's death. Among the objects left in the room and not seized as evidence was a kerosene lantern with a smoked glass. The glass was coated with a uniform layer of black soot, almost opaque. Aberline took the lantern, lit it, and held it to the whitewashed wall, peering at it through the smoked glass. He saw the symbols. The whitewash hadn't obscured them. The lime only altered the contrast between the symbols and the surface, making them invisible under normal lighting. But when viewed through heavily tinted glass, the difference in light absorption between the symbols and the background became visible. Aberline sketched what he saw, character by character, in his notebook. 3 rows of symbols. The top row contains 9 characters, the middle row 6, the bottom row 4. The characters are not Latin, Greek, or Cyrillic. The script is angular, with characteristic horizontal serifs. Several characters are repeated in different rows within the same script, suggesting the presence of an alphabet or syllabic system rather than arbitrary ornamentation. The next day, he sent the sketches to the British Museum. The reply arrived a day later, without a cover letter, with only a single handwritten note in the margin. Akkadian cuneiform, late Babylonian period. Translation enclosed. The translation took up half a page. Aberline included it in the report, unabridged. Top row. The flesh is gathered, the blood is received, the gates are opened for him who comes. Middle row. In the name of him who was before names, enter what was built for you. Bottom row. The seal is affixed. There is no return. Aberline copied the translation twice. One copy was filed. He folded the second one and put it in his uniform's breast pocket. Then he returned to the question of the nature of the substance used to apply the symbols. The official forensic team, during the initial examination of Annie Chapman's death scene, identified the stains on the wall as blood. Blood type was not determined in 1888, since this area of medicine did not yet exist as a scientific discipline. Aberline consulted the Scotland Yard surgeon on duty on the following question. Could blood applied to brickwork retain any visual properties distinguishing it from the background more than 2 months after application? The surgeon answered in the negative. Blood on a porous brick surface becomes invisible within a few days, even without precipitation or cleaning. After 2 months of exposure to the open air, it disappears completely. Aberline recorded this conclusion. He then recorded the following. The symbols on the wall of the house on Hanbury Street were painted on the night of the 8th to the 9th of September, 1888. By the time of the re-examination on November 14th, 66 days had passed. During this period, the site was exposed to rain, fog, and temperature fluctuations. According to the surgeon's conclusion, the blood could not have been preserved in a recognizable form. However, the symbols were still visible through the smoked glass. This means one of two things. Either the substance is not blood in the usual medical sense, or a substance has been added to the blood to prevent it from breaking down. No other chemical agent known to me has this property when applied to a porous surface in open-air conditions. Below this paragraph in the report is a line that archivists, upon declassification, specifically noted as not amenable to unambiguous interpretation in the context of the document. This line is written in the same handwriting and in the same ink as the rest of the text. It reads, "A sample of the substance scraped by me from the wall at Miller's Court and placed in a glass vial was found to be warm to the touch by the following morning. The temperature in the room was approximately 4 degrees Celsius. The vial is not listed as evidence seized." The ambush was organized on the night of November 21st to 22nd, 1888. Aberline chose this day for a reason. According to his calculations based on the geometry of the pentagram and the estimated schedule of the ritual cycle, the killer was obliged to act within the next 4 days. The organ list contained 7 positions. 5 were closed, 2 remained. Aberline didn't know in what order they would be collected or from which victims, but he knew one thing. The killer would return to the area delineated by the circle on his map. The geometry allowed for no deviation. The group consisted of 14 people. 8 plainclothes constables were deployed at key intersections in Whitechapel and Stepney, including Commercial Road, Aldgate, and Whitechapel Road. 4 uniformed constables were on visible duty as part of a routine night patrol, creating the appearance of a standard police presence. 2 detectives, including Aberline himself, took up position in the gateway of a house at the junction of Flower and Dean Street and Commercial Street, with a direct view of 3 streets at once. Every 20 minutes a prearranged signal was transmitted along the chain. A double whistle meant clear. A single long blast meant suspicious object. The fog arrived around midnight. The London November fog of 1888 was a phenomenon of a fundamentally different order from what modern man denotes by this word. It was formed from the combination of the River Thames fumes with the coal smoke from thousands of fireplaces and factory chimneys, creating a suspension that doctors of the time called yellow fog or London peculiar. Visibility on such a night in open spaces ranged from 5 to 15 yards, depending on the density. In gateways and alleys, it dropped to 0. At 1:47 a.m., a single, drawn-out whistle sounded from a position on Flower and Dean Street. Aberline and a second detective, Sergeant George Godley, moved out immediately. The signal was coming from Trovis Street, a narrow alley between warehouses 120 yards northeast of their position. They walked quickly, but without running. Aberline had forbidden running beforehand, as the noise of footsteps in the still night would have prematurely exposed the group. The fog absorbed sounds unevenly. Voices were muffled, but the click of heels on the cobblestones echoed clearly. At the entrance to Trovis Street, they were met by Constable Thomas Arnold. Aberline described his face succinctly in his report. The expression of a man who has seen something for which he has no words. Arnold pointed down the alley and reported the following. Approximately 40 yards from the entrance, he discovered a woman lying on the cobblestones, and above her, a figure in a long black cloak kneeling. The figure spoke words in a language Arnold didn't recognize. The words were rhythmic, with repeated intonation pauses, like a prayer or an incantation. Aberline ordered Arnold and Godley to take up positions on either side of the alley. He himself moved forward in the center, his right hand on the butt of his service revolver. The fog in the alley was thicker than outside. The stone walls held it back, preventing it from dispersing. A figure emerged from this gray mass gradually, like an image emerging from a photographic plate. It was kneeling over the body of a woman. The cloak was completely solid, without a single light element from collar to heels. The hood was pulled down so low that the face was completely invisible. The figure's hands were above the victim's body in a position Aberline described as a surgeon's hands over a surgical field. Elbows raised, hands pointing downward, movements precise and slow. The voice was even, not a whisper, not a shout. A steady, monotonous recitative, which Aberline recognized within seconds as Latin. Not the classical Latin of academic texts, but a more archaic form, with distorted endings and an unfamiliar stress. He would later describe it as ecclesiastical Latin, filtered through an alien syntax. He stopped 15 yards from the figure and stated his rank and position. The figure did not respond. The voice did not change tempo or tone. Aberline repeated the demand to stop, this time phrasing it as a direct order. There was no response. He took another 5 steps forward. 10 yards away, he saw the woman on the cobblestones, clearly enough to determine that she was alive. Her chest rose and fell. The eyes were open, but the pupils did not respond to the light of the flashlight. She was in a state that Aberline described in his report as catalepsy. Sergeant Godley moved out from the flank and took up a position to the left of the figure. Constable Arnold took up a position to the right. Aberline ordered a halt in the name of the law for the third and final time. The figure fell silent. It was the only moment of silence in the alley since the group's arrival. The silence lasted, Aberline estimated, about 4 seconds. Then the figure slowly rose from its knees. The movement was fluid, lacking the stiffness that comes with being stuck in one position for so long on cold stone. She rose to her full height. Aberline estimated her height at approximately 6 feet 2 inches. The hooded head turned toward him. He couldn't see her face. The hood was deep, and the distance made it impossible to discern features. But he recorded the following detail, which is highlighted in the report as a separate paragraph without any explanation. There was no darkness in the depths of the hood. There was something there that had color. Not bright, not glowing in the literal sense of the word. Rather less dark than it should have been. Just like the symbols on the wall of Miller's Court, viewed through smoked glass. Godley fired first, without orders. Aberline didn't criticize him for this in his report. The distance was minimal, The target was motionless, and the figure's actions over the helpless victim provided complete legal justification for the use of the weapon. The bullet missed its target. Aberline didn't use the word stopped. He wrote more precisely. The bullet traveled approximately 2 yards from the muzzle and slowed. Then it stopped in the air at a distance of approximately 1 yard from the figure. In the light of Arnold's flashlight, it was seen hanging motionless for about half a second. Then it fell onto the cobblestone. The sound of the fall was distinct. Arnold picked it up later and confirmed. The bullet was deformed in the same way lead deforms when it hits a hard surface, but there was no hard surface between the muzzle and the body. Godley fired twice more. The result was identical. 2 bullets struck the cobblestones a yard from the figure, half a second apart. Aberline fired himself. His bullet followed the fate of the previous ones. The figure didn't move during the shots. It didn't react to the sound. It didn't change its posture. Then it made one move, a step to the side, toward the alley wall, and she dissolved into it. She didn't enter it. There was no creaking door, no sound of a hatch opening. She simply ceased to exist in the space where she had been a second ago. Arnold rushed to the wall and felt it with his hands. Solid brick. No openings. The woman on the cobblestones emerged from her stupor a few minutes later. She remembered nothing from the moment she turned into the alley. A medical examination performed by the surgeon on duty that same night revealed no physical injuries. No organ was removed. The ritual was interrupted before it was completed. The 6th position on the list no longer existed, but the 7th remained open, and Aberline knew it. On the last line of his notes that night, he recorded the only conclusion he could draw from what had happened. Firearms are unsuitable. Another method is required. 4 bullets were recovered from the cobblestones of Trovis Street before dawn. Aberline personally examined each one by flashlight, then wrapped all 4 in a piece of paper from his notebook and pocketed them. The metal deformation on each of them was identical, a dull, uniform dent as if struck against a flat steel plate from a distance of several inches. Not jagged, not asymmetrical, as is the case with a blow against brick or wood. Smooth. It was as if the bullet had hit an invisible surface and compressed its nose against it before coming to rest. Godley didn't file a report on the incident. Aberline didn't require one. Arnold filed a report, but on Aberline's verbal instructions, he described the incident as pursuit of an unidentified suspect who escaped through the rear entrance of a warehouse. This account included no gunshots, no stopped bullets, no wall through which a man passed. Arnold signed the report. Godley signed it as a witness. Both remained silent about the true nature of that night for the rest of their careers. Aberline returned home at 5 in the morning, didn't go to bed, and was already at his desk by 8. He copied the contents of his nightly notes into a clean copy, then put his pen down and looked out the window for a while. Outside, a light November rain was falling. The street was empty. Then he took a clean sheet of paper and wrote one word on it. Watson. He underlined it. He put a question mark after it, crossed it out, wrote another word. Order. He didn't cross that word out. The existence of secret societies in Victorian England in 1888 was not officially recognized by state institutions, but was also no secret to people who occupied certain positions in the state hierarchy. During his 20 years of service, Aberline had several encounters with cases involving organizations that were not officially registered but nevertheless wielded obvious influence. He never delved into their nature beyond the specific investigation required. It was a reasonable professional position, but now reasonable professional positions had outlived their usefulness. He wrote a letter. The addressee was not named in the report. Aberline identified him as a man whose connections with certain circles were known to me from previous cases. He summarized the letter's contents briefly. The inspector was requesting an audience with a representative of an organization that studies phenomena not classified by official science. He indicated that this was an active investigation with a time limit. The letter was sent by courier that same day. The reply arrived the following morning. Not by letter. A man came to see Aberline. He didn't give his name. In his report, the inspector described him as a man of about 55, of a lean build, with the manners of a man accustomed to being listened to. The man claimed to represent an organization he identified as the Brotherhood of Guardians. Aberline noted in his report that this name was apparently a working pseudonym for the purposes of this meeting, not the official name of the organization. The man confirmed this indirectly, adding that the real name is not to be uttered outside of certain rooms. The meeting took place in Aberline's office behind closed doors. The inspector laid out the facts without clarification. The geometry of the crime scenes, the list of organs according to the Babylonian tablet, the symbols on the walls, the ambush on Trovis Street, the behavior of bullets. The man listened without interrupting. His face, as Aberline described it, remained professionally neutral, which the inspector interpreted not as indifference but as a habit of sharing such information. When Aberline finished, the man was silent for about a minute. Then he spoke. The guest confirmed the following, Aberline wrote. What he calls a vessel of inhabitation is known by several names in the tradition of his organization, the most accurate of which in English is carnal vehicle. This is not a metaphor. This is the technical designation for a physical structure created to house a non-physical entity. The organization has documented evidence of 3 such attempts in Europe over the past 200 years. None of them were completed. The reasons for the interruption in 2 cases have been established. In the 3rd case, the ritual was interrupted by circumstances that the guest described as an accidental intervention, the nature of which was never identified. Aberline asked a direct question. What exactly is created as a result of the completed ritual? The guest replied that the inspector had already received an answer to this question from a British Museum employee and that it was accurate. Then the guest added what the British Museum employee hadn't said. The spirit infused into a carnal vehicle is not a random infernal element. He is a specific entity, named in the Babylonian classification. The guest mentioned this name, but I do not reproduce it in the document for reasons he explained as follows. Recording a name in a written text creates a connection between the name and the place where the text is stored. This connection, under certain conditions, can be used by the entity as a reference point. I have taken this argument into account. The guest then moved on to the issue of protection. He stated the following. The magical barrier that stopped the bullets on Trovis Street is a standard defensive formation for high-level practitioners and cannot be overcome by physical impact. Firearms, bladed weapons, punches, and any other mechanical attacks will remain ineffective while the barrier is active. The barrier is always active when the practitioner is in a state of ritual concentration, that is, while casting a spell. Outside of ritual, the barrier requires a dedicated effort of will to maintain and can be weakened by an unexpected interruption of concentration. Aberline noted this and asked how one could break a practitioner's concentration without being in physical contact with them. The guest responded that this was the wrong question. The correct question is, how can one neutralize not the practitioner but the result of his work, that is, the already created carnal conduit if the ritual is completed before police intervention? Aberline recorded this question and the answer. The guest reported the following. The created fleshly vehicle is vulnerable at one point. During the final stage of the ritual, a summoning seal is applied to the body, a symbol that serves both as an anchor for the indwelling spirit and as its point of connection to the material vessel. Without this seal, the spirit cannot be retained within the body. Destroying the seal after the ritual's completion immediately severs the connection. The spirit returns to the region from which it was summoned. The body, without the spirit, immediately returns to a state corresponding to the actual biological age of its constituent tissues. That is, it disintegrates. Aberline clarified how the seal was destroyed. The guest pulled a small glass vial from this coat's inside pocket. The report described its contents. A clear, colorless, odorless liquid. The guest placed the bottle on the table in front of the inspector and explained that it was water consecrated according to a rite predating the Reformation, with the addition of 3 components he did not name. Physical contact with the seal immediately destroys the water's structure. The guest added, "The method of applying water to the seal is irrelevant. It is sufficient to wet any object that can touch the symbol on the creature's body." The vial remained on the table after the guest left. Aberline picked it up, held it up to the light, and put it away in a drawer, wrapping it in the same cloth that had held the 4 deformed bullets. His final entry that day consisted of a single sentence. "The problem isn't how to destroy the creature. The problem is, until the seal is broken, it will remain between us and the vial." Geometry hadn't lied. Aberline returned to the map on November 23, 1888, and made the final calculation. The pentagram formed by the 5 murder sites had a center. He had identified the center back in November, immediately after Mary Jane Kelly's death. But back then, it was a point on the map, not tied to a specific building. Now, having received a detailed map of the Wapping area from the Office of Public Works, he superimposed it on the pentagram and aligned the coordinates. The pentagram's center fell on a stretch of the east bank of the Thames, 300 yards south of Wapping Street. On a detailed map, the site was labeled Griffith & Sons Slaughterhouse, inactive, 1881. The building was listed in the city's property registry as slated for demolition, but the demolition was delayed due to an ongoing property dispute between the original owner's heirs and the city council. The building effectively stood empty for 7 years. According to the nearby police station, 3 complaints had been received from local residents during this time about suspicious people near the building, but none of the inspections revealed any violations. Aberline wrote down the address, folded the map, and put it away in a folder. He then wrote a request to the head of the operations department, requesting the deployment of a reinforced team to search an abandoned building at an address in Wapping. He stated the reason for the request: intelligence indicating the use of the facility in connection with the Whitechapel murders. He didn't provide any details. They wouldn't have been included in the official request. The head of the operations department, Superintendent Arnold, partially granted the request. He allocated 8 constables and 2 detectives instead of the requested 12 and 6, respectively. The reason for the reduction was administrative. 2 constables were on sick leave. 4 were involved in other work. Aberline accepted it without objection. 10 people plus himself, 11 in total. The visitor from the Brotherhood of Guardians showed up unannounced the next day at 8:30 in the morning. He sat down across from Aberline and informed him that his organization had learned of the search warrant in Wapping. He didn't explain how he'd learned of this, and Aberline didn't ask. The guest expressed his desire to participate in the operation personally. He added that his presence was not a whim. There were aspects of the situation that physical weapons and legal authority would not be sufficient to control. Aberline agreed. He recorded this decision in his report without comment. The next 2 days were spent monitoring the structure in Wapping. Aberline dispatched 2 plainclothes constables with instructions to record any movement near the structure, but to stay within 100 yards of it. Over 48 hours of surveillance, constables recorded the following. A man in a dark coat approached the building 3 times, checked the lock on the gate, and left. Twice, thin vertical smoke rose from behind the building's wall, unlike that of a garbage fire. 2 white and 2 uniform. One time, on the night of November 24th to 25th, at about 2 o'clock in the morning, both constables, independently of each other, recorded a sound. They described it differently. One wrote, "a low, monotonous hum, like an organ in an empty cathedral," while the other wrote, "a steady sound, like someone reading aloud at high speed." Both noted that the sound stopped after exactly 7 minutes. A visitor from the Brotherhood of Guardians listened to this information and informed Aberline of the following. White vertical smoke is a sign of the burning of certain resins during the preparatory rituals. The sound recorded by the constables matches the description of the final stage of the summoning spell. 7 minutes is not a random duration. 7 is a ritually significant number in Babylonian tradition, and according to the tablet's text, that's how long the final spell requires to complete its full execution. Aberline asked directly whether the ritual was complete. The guest replied that it was not. If the ritual had been completed, the effects would have been immediately felt beyond the structure. He didn't specify what those effects were, but he added something else. Judging by the constable's observations, the performer was in the final stages of preparation. The list of organs was presumably completely closed, including the 2 positions that remained open after the ambush on Throwes Street. This meant that somewhere in London, there were 2 more victims whose bodies the police had not found. Aberline immediately sent inquiries to every morgue and police station in the East End. The answer arrived the following morning. On November 24, 1888, the body of an undocumented woman was discovered in the Thames near Blackfriars Bridge. The degree of decomposition indicated at least 3 days in the water. The body was transferred to the city morgue. The autopsy report prepared by the surgeon on duty noted abnormal absence of several internal organs, presumably due to exposure to river fauna. The surgeon didn't connect this case to the Ripper, as the latter was officially considered a Whitechapel, not city, killer. The police never found a second victim. Aberline speculated that the body was deliberately destroyed or hidden by the perpetrator after the organs were removed. A guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians confirmed this version as probable. According to the tablet's text, the ritualist is not obligated to leave the body in place. Only the act of removal is obligatory, not the location or fate of the body left behind. The list was closed entirely. The ritual awaited only the final stage. The operation was scheduled for November 26, 1888. Departure time, 11 p.m. Aberline briefed the squad at the police station nearest to Wapping. He explained the following. The operation is a search of an abandoned building on suspicion of harboring a criminal. Firearms are to be carried. If the suspect is found, immediately surround him and avoid physical contact until further notice. In any unusual circumstances, act strictly according to his command. He didn't describe the unusual circumstances. The constables didn't ask. The professional discipline of the Victorian police didn't allow for questions during briefings. The visitor from the Brotherhood of Guardians stood by the window during the entire briefing and didn't say a word. Before leaving, he approached Aberline and handed him a small object. In his report, the inspector described it as a flat leather case about the size of a cigarette case. Inside was a vial of holy water, identical to the one the guest had left on the table during their first meeting, and a short blade with a bone hilt. The blade was soaked in the same liquid and wrapped in oiled cloth. The guest spoke a single sentence. Aberline quoted it verbatim. "If the creature is already on its feet when you enter, don't shoot it. Just waste time getting to the seal." The squad left the station at 11 o'clock in the evening. The abandoned Griffith & Sons slaughterhouse was 400 yards away as the crow flies along the banks of the Thames. A November fog lay thick on the river, and the smell of water mingled with the odor of coal smoke and something else, which Aberline described briefly and without further ado in his report. The smell of sulfur was noticeable 200 yards from the building. The slaughterhouse gates were newly locked. This was the first detail Aberline noticed upon his arrival. Amidst the general disrepair of the building, its walls covered in perennial moss and its window boards long blackened by damp, the lock on the gate looked as if it had been purchased no more than a month ago. Shiny, without a trace of rust, with an oily sheen on the shackle. Someone had ensured that no random people would enter, and someone clearly hadn't expected anyone else to enter. Constable Reginald Barnes knocked the lock off with a sledgehammer blow on the second try. The gate hinges were rusty and gave way without resistance. The left panel swung inward with a drawn-out metallic groan, while the right panel sagged and lodged itself in the ground, tilted at an angle. The squad entered through the resulting opening 2 at a time, Aberline first. The slaughterhouse courtyard was a rectangle approximately 40 by 20 yards, paved with large cobblestones with grass growing between them. Along 3 walls stood single-story buildings that had previously served as cattle pens.
Четвертую стену занимало основное здание. Двухэтажное, с широкими воротами на уровне земли, достаточными для въезда груженной телеги. Ворота основного здания были закрыты, но не заперты. Они держались только на опущенном деревянном засове изнутри. Свет шел из основного здания. Не электрический и не газовый. В 1888 году ни то, ни другое в подобном строении не было возможным. Сквозь щели между досками просачивался ровный красноватый свет, неподвижный, без колебаний, характерных для открытого огня. Эберлайн описал его как «свет, лишённый источника в привычном смысле слова». Запах серы здесь был значительно сильнее, чем снаружи. К нему примешивался другой запах, который несколько констеблей впоследствии описали в своих частных свидетельствах по-разному. Один написал «гнилое мясо в тепле». Другой написал «влажная земля после длительного дождя». Третий не стал описывать запах словами, указав только, что он вызвал у него острый рвотный рефлекс, который пришлось подавить усилием воли. Эберлайн в рапорте написал следующее. Запах органической материи в процессе разложения, однако с компонентом, не характерным для естественного гниения, который я не могу идентифицировать точнее. Деревянный засов сдвинули изнутри с помощью длинного железного прута, просунутого через щель между створками. Ворота открыли медленно, без рывка. Эберлайн поднял руку, останавливая отряд. Сам он вошел первым, один, оставив группу у ворот на 10 секунд. То, что он увидел за эти 10 секунд, он описал в рапорте с той же протокольной точностью, которую выдерживал на протяжении всего документа. Но именно этот фрагмент рапорта архивисты при рассекречивании снабдили пометкой «Содержание подтверждено показаниями 8 независимых свидетелей из состава отряда». Основное помещение бойни было единым залом приблизительно 30 ярдов в длину и 15 в ширину. Прежде здесь производили забой скота. Вдоль стен сохранились проржавевшие железные крюки, цепи и желоба для стока крови. Пол из широких дубовых досок потемнел от старых органических загрязнений. Потолок уходил вверх на 2 яруса и терялся в темноте. В центре зала стоял алтарь. Это слово Эберлайн употребил без кавычек и без пояснений, как будто никакое другое слово не подходило точнее. Конструкция представляла собой прямоугольный стол приблизительно 6 футов в длину, собранный из толстых дубовых досок на массивных ножках. Поверхность стола была покрыта слоем вещества темно-коричневого цвета, запекшегося неравномерно, с более темными участками по краям. По периметру стола стояли 7 черных свечей высотой около фута каждая. Они горели. Не красноватым светом, замеченным снаружи, а обычным желтым пламенем, без каких-либо аномалий. Красноватый свет шел от другого источника. На столе лежало существо. Эберлайн потратил на его описание больше слов, чем на описание любого другого объекта во всем рапорте.
He began with the general parameters, a humanoid approximately 6 feet long lying on its back. Then he moved on to the details, and here the formal precision of his language took on a quality difficult to define. He wrote like a forensic scientist describing an object on the dissection table, without intonation, without judgment. The body is composite. The stitches are visible to the naked eye, rough stitches of thick, dark thread running along the lines where the fragments are joined. The fragments vary in skin color and degree of decomposition. Some areas have a bluish tint, typical of tissues exposed to low temperatures. Other areas have an earthy gray-green hue, indicating a longer period of time spent outside the living organism. The face is missing in the conventional sense. The features are formed from several mismatched fragments joined using the same technique. A reddish glow emanates from the chest. Through the intercostal spaces, not completely closed by sutures, a faint, pulsating glow is visible within. The pulsation rate roughly corresponds to the heart rate. Below this description follows a short insert, which Eberlein labeled personal observation, not of a protocol nature. The creature did not breathe. The chest was motionless. but the glow within pulsated. These were two separate processes, unrelated. He raised his hand and signaled for the squad to enter. 10 people entered the hall and spread out along the walls as instructed. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians entered last and took up a position against the right wall, in the shadows, away from the candles. He wasn't looking at the altar, but at the far end of the hall. Aberline followed his gaze. At the far end of the hall, against a blank wall, stood a man. He stood with his back to those who had entered and facing the wall, on which a circle approximately 4 feet in diameter had been drawn. Within the circle were symbols identical to those Aberline had sketched through the smoked glass on Miller's Court. The man held an object in his right hand, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be a small book bound in dark leather. His left hand was extended, palm facing the wall. He read aloud in an even voice without rising or falling. Latin, the same archaic form with distorted endings that Aberline had heard on Trovis Street. The visitor from the Brotherhood of Guardians quietly pronounced the name of the man by the wall. Not interrogatively, but affirmatively, as one pronounces the name of someone who has been identified. Aberline did not reproduce this name in his report. He wrote only the following. The visitor mentioned a name. The name was familiar to me. The man standing by the wall occupied one of the highest positions in the country's legislative assembly. I am not reproducing that name in this document for reasons I believe will be obvious to anyone reading this report in the future. The reading at the wall continued. On the altar in the center of the room, the creature opened its eyes. The eyes were completely black. Not dark brown, not dilated from shock to the limit of the iris. Black from edge to edge, without whites, without a pupil, without any demarcation between the structures of the eyeball. 2 completely opaque surfaces, absorbing candlelight without reflection. Aberline was 7 yards from the altar and saw them clearly. He recorded the following. The eyes opened simultaneously, without any preliminary movement of the lids. There was no trembling of the eyelashes, nor the partial opening characteristic of the awakening of a living being. They were simply closed, and then opened. The interval between these 2 states was indistinguishably small. The reading at the far wall continued. The voice of the man with the book did not change pace and did not respond to the movement in the center of the room. Either he didn't see what was happening, his back turned, or he saw it and didn't think it necessary to react. The reddish glow in the creature's chest intensified. It now pierced the seams in wider stripes, staining the nearby floorboards the color of cooling coal. Constable Barnes, standing closest to the altar on the right flank, took a step back, involuntarily, without command. The sole of his boot creaked on the board. The sound was soft, but in the acoustics of the empty hall, it echoed clearly from wall to wall. The creature turned its head toward the sound. Neither smoothly nor abruptly, the head moved from one position to another with mechanical precision, without intermediate phases of movement, like a compass needle responding to a changing magnetic field. The black eyes settled on Barnes. Aberline was looking at the constable rather than at the creature at the time, and he recorded the following. Barnes did not scream or run. He simply stopped moving completely, including breathing, for several seconds, like a man caught unawares in the dark who instinctively freezes, hoping to go unnoticed. His calculations failed. The creature was already looking at him. Its right hand rose from the surface of the altar. The movement was slow, almost majestic, and it was precisely this slowness, according to Aberline's subsequent assessment, that proved most psychologically damaging to the personnel. Rapid movement provokes a reaction. The slow movement of a creature, anatomically composed of dead human fragments, raising its hand from the ritual table in complete silence, provoked nothing but numbness. The leather straps that bound the creature's wrists to the side posts of the altar tightened. Aberline heard the leather creak under the strain. Then the strap on his right wrist snapped. Not gradually, not with a growing crack, but instantly, with a sharp pop, like a taut rope snapping. A shred of leather fell to the boards. The strap was 2 inches wide and half an inch thick. These straps are used to secure horses during shoeing. The left strap snapped after 2 seconds. The creature rose up on its elbows. The stitches on his sides and back stretched as he moved, and where the tension was greatest, a liquid the color of old blood oozed out between the stitches, dark, almost black, with no odor detectable from a distance. His head turned slowly, scanning the room. The black eyes swept the right wall, then the left, lingered on Aberline for a second, then moved on. It wasn't the gaze of a creature assessing a threat. It was the gaze of a creature taking note of the contents of the space. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians quietly and clearly uttered the only phrase during his entire stay in the hall. Aberline cited it in his report. The visitor addressed me by his last name and reported the following. The ritual is not complete. The seal has not yet been applied. And if the person at the wall is stopped before he has time to apply it, the creature will be left without an anchor and will disintegrate on its own. He added that we had approximately 2 minutes before the spell was complete. Aberline immediately ordered the 2 detectives to move to the far wall and stop the reading. Detectives Godley and Moore advanced from the left flank, keeping along the wall away from the altar. The distance to the man with the book was about 25 yards. They had covered about half that distance. The creature sat down on the altar. The movement was uniform and continuous, from a position on the elbows to a sitting position, without jerks and without intermediate stops, with the same mechanical precision as the turn of the head. The ankle straps still held him, but that changed immediately. The creature pulled its legs forward once without any apparent effort, and both straps snapped simultaneously. Godley stopped. Moore continued moving toward the far wall, accelerating. He was 10 yards from the man with the book when the creature rose from the altar. The rise took what Aberline estimated to be about 3 seconds. The creature swung its feet over the edge of the table, found purchase on the floorboards, and rose to its full height. 6 feet and a few inches over that. Aberline mentally compared his height with the doorway visible in the far wall and estimated the excess over the standard height of the doorway at 4 or 5 inches. As he straightened, there was a cracking sound in several places across the creature's body. Not like the cracking of a living person's joints during a warm-up, but a dull, wet sound like frozen wood cracking. Constable Reginald Barnes fired. He stood 6 yards from the creature and put a bullet into the center of its chest. The hit was obvious. A fragment of tissue from the left side of the chest was torn out, revealing a dark cavity under the ribs from which black liquid splashed onto the floorboards. The reddish glow inside intensified momentarily through the hole, like the draft in a furnace intensifies when the ash vent is opened. The creature looked at Barnes. Not at the wound. At Barnes. Then it stepped toward him. 1 step, 2, 3. Barnes fired twice more, in the stomach and in the head. The bullet struck without deviation. The creature's head snapped back from the impact and returned to its original position. It continued to advance. Aberline shouted at Barnes to retreat. Barnes took 2 steps back, tripped over his own feet, and fell to 1 knee. The creature had him in that position. The right hand, the first to rise from the altar, described a short arc and grabbed Barnes by the left shoulder. The fingers tightened. Aberline heard the sound. He described it in his report as the crunch of dense material under sudden pressure. Barnes didn't scream. He didn't have time. The creature grabbed him by the neck with its other hand and jerked him from the floor to arm's length. Barnes weighed about 170 pounds. The upward movement took a split second. Aberline described what happened next in 1 sentence without detail. This is the only place in the report where he deliberately limited his description. Constable Barnes died instantly. I am recording the manner of death in a separate appendix, which I request to be considered classified. The appendix is missing from the declassified materials. While the creature was preoccupied with Barnes, Detective Moore reached the far wall. He grabbed the man with the book by the shoulder and turned him around to face him. The reading stopped. The man with the book did not physically resist. He simply fell silent and looked at Moore with an expression that the detective later described as the absolute calm of a man who knows the outcome of events in advance. In the center of the hall, the creature lowered whatever it was holding and turned toward the far wall. The reading did not resume. The seal on the creature's forehead was not imprinted. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians uttered a single word, addressing no one in particular. Aberline reproduced it in the report without translation, transliterating it from Latin, and added in parentheses, presumably a term from the lexicon of the guest organization, denoting an intermediate state between a completed and an unfinished ritual. The creature moved toward the far wall, toward the man with the book, towards Detective Moore, who stood between them. The far wall was 20 yards away. Aberline ordered Moore to retreat just as the creature was halfway to the far wall. Moore heard and obeyed the command. He released the man with the book, stepped to the right, and pressed himself against the wall, allowing the creature to pass him. It was the right decision. The creature didn't react to Moore. Its trajectory remained unchanged. It walked straight toward the man with the book without detouring or slowing down. The man with the book didn't retreat. He stood against the wall with the circle drawn on it, looking at the approaching creature with the same expression of absolute calm Moore had noted upon first contact. In his left hand, he still held the dark leather-bound book. His right arm hung at his side. When the creature approached within 3 yards, the man with the book began to speak. It wasn't Latin. Aberline, 15 yards away and moving along the right wall toward the far end of the room, made out individual syllables but couldn't identify the language. A nearby visitor from the Guardian Brotherhood later informed Aberline that the language was Akkadian, a late Babylonian dialect, and that the text being spoken was not a continuation of the interrupted summoning spell, but a fundamentally different text. He called it the anchor word, a formula that anchors the infused spirit in a material vessel without the application of a physical seal. The guest added that a similar method was a known, but extremely rarely used option, requiring the performer to have direct visual contact with the creature at a distance of no more than 5 yards. The performer deliberately allowed the creature to get close to him so as to complete the ritual with a verbal anchor instead of a physical seal. This meant that stopping the book reading had no effect. The ritual continued. The creature stopped a yard in front of the man with the book. It did not attack him. Aberline recorded this as a detail requiring a separate explanation, which he received later from a guest. At the moment the verbal anchor was pronounced, the performer and the creature were in a state of ritual connection, and any physical impact of the creature on the performer would interrupt this connection, destroying the unfinished anchor. The creature instinctively didn't do this, as the infused spirit strove to anchor itself in the material vessel and couldn't act against its own completion. The man with the book continued speaking, looking into the creature's black eyes. The reddish glow in the creature's chest began to change. The heartbeat quickened. If previously it had been around 70 beats per minute, now the frequency had increased to 120 and continued to increase. The light through the seams became more intense and changed its hue from reddish to a darker, almost violet. Aberline described the process this way. It felt as if something was filling inside the chest, not with liquid, not with air, a source of pressure that was seeking an outlet through the sutures and finding none. The boards under the creature's feet darkened for about a foot around him, as wood darkens with moisture. But there was no moisture on the floor. Aberline was at this moment 8 yards from the man with the book. The path to him was clear. The creature stood with its back to the hall facing the wall, and there was no one between Aberline and the ritualist. He could have reached the man with the book and physically interrupted the recitation of the text again. He didn't. In his report, he explained the reason. A guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians stopped me with a sign. He pointed to the creature's chest and then made a gesture, the meaning of which I interpreted as a warning. Interrupting the verbal anchor at the current stage could cause an uncontrolled release of accumulated energy. I didn't have the knowledge to evaluate this warning, but I had sufficient reason to trust it. This decision cost Detective Moore his life. Moore stood against the right wall, 3 yards from the creature, watching the scene. A subsequent reconstruction of his actions was based on the testimony of Constable Arnold, who was nearby. Moore apparently made the decision to act independently, without receiving orders. He drew his utility knife and stepped toward the creature from behind, intending, judging by the direction of the blow, to reach the neck. The creature didn't look in his direction. Nevertheless, it reacted before Moore could strike. The creature's right arm moved backward without twisting its body, describing an arc behind its back with an amplitude unachievable by a normal human shoulder joint. The hand found Moore in the darkness behind it with a precision that required no visual control. The blow was a single, backhanded strike to the detective's chest. Moore was thrown 4 yards and struck the oak planks of the wall. Arnold, standing nearby, recorded that the impact with the wall was significantly quieter than it should have been given the trajectory. He found no explanation for this in his testimony. Moore sank to the floor and did not rise. A medical examination later found multiple rib fractures and internal organ damage incompatible with life. The man with the book continued speaking. At that moment, the guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians did something Aberline hadn't expected. He emerged from the shadows near the right wall and moved toward the center of the room with a quick, purposeful stride. He held an object Aberline hadn't seen before, a short staff of dark wood with a metal tip. The guest stopped in the center of the hall between the altar and the far wall, stood up to his full height, and spoke. His voice was significantly louder than the man with the book. The language was still Akkadian, but the intonation pattern was fundamentally different. Not a monotonous recitative, but sharp, precise phrases with stressed syllables, pronounced with a raised voice. Aberline described this as an antiphon, 2 texts sung simultaneously and directed against each other. The creature reacted immediately. It turned from the wall toward the center of the room. The man with the book behind it fell silent for a split second, then continued, raising his voice to drown out the guest. The violet glow in the creature's chest flickered and faded briefly, then returned. The increasing pulsation rate ceased. The guest continued. The creature took a step toward him, then another. The man with the book behind the creature's back sped up the tempo of this speech, fading into an almost inaudible patter. The guest didn't speed up. He maintained the same rhythm, the same emphasis, the same amplitude of his voice. This wasn't a contest of speed, but a battle of precision. The creature stopped 4 yards from the guest. The pause lasted 3 or 4 seconds. Then the purple light inside the chest suddenly flared, simultaneously sending a thin column of black smoke upward through the unsealed seams. The smell of sulfur became suffocating. The smoke hit the ceiling, spread under the beams, and began to descend, evenly filling the upper third of the room. Several constables near the walls began coughing. Aberline held his position. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians continued to recite the text, though his voice became hoarse for a few seconds. A man with a book at the far end of the room shouted a single short phrase in Akkadian. Not a recitative, a cry, with a piercing quality to his voice that hadn't been there before. The guest immediately responded with the same phrase, calmly and without raising his voice. After this exchange, the following occurred in the hall. The glow in the creature's chest faded completely for a split second. Then it returned but changed color. From purple, it turned white, almost unbearably bright. All the shadows in the room vanished at once. I saw every crack in the floorboards, every seam on the creature's body, every face in the squad with photographic clarity. Then the creature raised its head and made a sound. Aberline described the sound separately, with the caveat that he was unsure of the accuracy of the description. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a roar. It was something that has no analog in living nature. A low-frequency sound, felt not so much by the ears as by the chest and lower abdomen. Several constables doubled over. Arnold started bleeding from his right ear. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians didn't bend. He spoke the last word of his text clearly and deliberately, and fell silent. The white light went out. The purple light didn't return. The creature stood in the center of the hall, completely darkened by the candles which had gone out along with the white light and no longer moved. The only sounds were the constable's breathing and the faint sound of something dripping from the ceiling. A man with a book near the far wall spoke a few words quietly and clearly. Aberline didn't understand them, but the guest did. He turned to the inspector and reported what had happened. The verbal anchor wasn't complete, but it wasn't completely broken either. The spirit within the vessel was in a precarious state, inhabited but not anchored. Without the final seal or the completed verbal anchor, he could neither take root in the body nor leave it on his own. This meant one thing: the seal had to be applied. The ritualist knew this, and he was going to apply it right now. The man with the book stepped out of the darkness toward the altar. A narrow blade flashed in his right hand. It was an athame. Aberline recognized it instantly. The very weapon whose cutting profile he had described in his first notes on the case back in September. A double-edged blade, tapering to a point, the handle made of a dark material, presumably burnt bone. It was about 9 inches long. The blade itself didn't gleam in the darkness. The light came from the man with the book holding it high, and the metal caught the residual glow from the coals in the brazier on the left wall, which Aberline hadn't noticed when he entered. The man moved toward the altar confidently, without haste. The creature's body stood motionless in the center of the hall, and he circled it in an arc, not getting any closer. The spirit within the vessel didn't react to its movements. The state of unstable equilibrium described by the guest apparently deprived the being of the ability to independently determine its goals. It stood and awaited the completion of what had created it. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians stepped in front of it. The man with the athame stopped. They looked at each other across the hall, separated by about 10 yards. The guest spoke in English, the first time he'd been in the building. He addressed the man with the athame by name, which Aberline again failed to reproduce in his report, and demanded that he stop, citing the name of the organization he represented. He added that the organization knew the identity of the performer, his connections, and all those involved in the preparation of the ritual. The man with the athame responded. Aberline paraphrased the content of his response without quoting it directly. The performer stated that he was not interested in the organization's threats, since after the ritual's completion, no earthly organization would have the means to influence him. He added that the being that would be created would alter the nature of the power available to him to a degree incomparable to any consequences of publicity. He spoke without affectation or fear, like a man who had made his decision so long ago that all the emotions associated with it had long since been exhausted. The guest fell silent. The man with the athame continued toward the altar. Aberline ordered the 2 nearest constables to physically stop him. Constables Harris and Fletcher advanced from the right flank to intercept him. The distance between them and the man with the athame was about 7 yards. They covered 4 of those yards. The creature moved, not toward the man with the athame, nor toward the guest, toward the constables. It reacted to the threat to the ritualist with the same unerring focus with which it had previously turned its head toward the sound of Barnes's footsteps. The spirit within the vessel, though not permanently anchored, nevertheless retained enough of a connection with the perpetrator to act in its defense. Harris managed to fire twice. Both bullets entered the creature's body and produced no visible effect. It neither slowed nor changed its trajectory. Fletcher stepped to the right, letting it pass, and rushed around the man with the athame. The creature grabbed Harris by the left forearm. The crunch could be heard from the far end of the room. Harris fell to his knees. The creature didn't linger. It lowered him to the floor and continued moving toward Fletcher. Aberline had been moving toward the altar since the creature had turned its attention to the constables. The path along the left wall was clear. The man with the athame was moving toward the altar through the center of the hall, The creature was intercepting the constables on the right, and the guest held his position in the center. The left flank was unguarded. Aberline took advantage of this without declaring his intentions out loud. He reached the altar a few seconds before the man with the athame. This advantage was minimal and likely to be of no use. The altar itself was not a target. The target was the creature, or more precisely, the area of its forehead where the seal was to be applied. But until the seal was applied, it didn't exist. There was nothing to destroy. He stood at the altar and waited. The man with the athame approached the altar from the opposite side. They found themselves on opposite sides of the table. The distance between them was about 6 feet. The man with the athame looked at Aberline without surprise, as one might look at an obstacle already accounted for in calculations. Then he raised the athame in both hands and began reciting what Aberline recognized as Latin, quickly and evenly. At that very moment, a short thud and the sound of a body falling came from the depths of the hall. Fletcher. Aberline didn't turn around. He was looking at the man with the athame, while at the same time, out of the corner of his eye, he tracked the movement of the creature unfolding in the depths of the hall. The creature was moving toward the altar. The man with the athame recited the incantation. The creature approached. Aberline stood at the altar and understood the following. As soon as the creature took its position at the altar, as soon as the performer placed the seal on its forehead, everything would become irreversible. The vial of holy water was in the inside pocket of his coat. The blade, soaked in the same water, was also there. Before the seal was applied, both objects were useless. The creature entered the candlelight and stopped at the edge of the altar next to the man with the athame. It stood still, like an animal accustomed to a certain procedure. The man with the athame lowered the athame and dipped its tip into a small vessel that stood on the altar, unnoticed by Aberline. The dark liquid in the vessel left a mark on the blade's metal that neither dripped nor evaporated. Aberline knew he didn't have time to wait for the seal to be applied and then fight the creature for access. By the time the ritual was complete, the creature would be fully activated, and its current state would seem harmless by comparison. He made a decision and recorded its logic in a report with the same precision with which he recorded everything else. The only way to gain access to the seal after it was applied was to be close to the creature at the moment of application. This meant not retreating from the altar, but rather taking a position right next to it, accepting all the attendant risks. He walked around the altar and stood next to the creature. The man with the athame raised the blade. The tip, coated in dark liquid, was pointed toward the creature's forehead. The Latin text continued uninterrupted. Aberline stood 2 feet from the creature and felt the heat radiating from it. Not the temperature of a living body, but a drier, more even heat, like that of a stone heated in the sun. The smell was so strong that he had to breathe shallowly and quickly, trying not to inhale deeply. The tip of the athame touched the creature's forehead. Aberline pulled the blade from his inner pocket. The man with the athame traced the first line of the symbol. The dark liquid settled on the creature's skin and remained there undisturbed. The glow in the chest instantly quickened and intensified. Aberline slashed his blade across the wrist of the hand holding the athame, aiming to dislodge the weapon rather than inflict a wound. He missed by an inch. The man with the athame pulled his hand back and looked at him. For the first time, something other than calm appeared in his eyes. The creature turned its head toward Aberline. Black, pupilless eyes stared at him from 18 inches away. The heat from his body intensified. The glow in his chest pulsed with a frequency that could no longer be counted as individual beats. It was a continuous light, fluctuating in intensity but never stopping. There was a single unfinished line on the creature's forehead. The man with the athame raised his blade again. The creature struck Aberline in the chest with an open palm. Not a fist, not a grab, an open palm, like someone pushing aside an object blocking their path. The blow was horizontal and short, without a backswing. Aberline flew 3 yards and hit his back against the side post of the altar. The wood cracked under his weight but didn't break. He slid to the floor and remained sitting, leaning against the post, holding the blade in his right hand. He didn't catch his breath for about 8 seconds. Not because the ribs were broken, the chest was still functioning. It was just that the diaphragm temporarily failed to respond to the impact, like a mechanism failing when the impact is too strong. Aberline recorded this period with a precision that suggests he was counting the seconds deliberately. 8 seconds without the ability to breathe. During these 8 seconds, the man with the athame drew 2 more lines of the symbol. 3 lines out of the presumably 5 or 6 that make up the complete seal. I saw it from the floor and couldn't get up. A guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians appeared at the altar's left side. He wasn't running. He was walking quickly, with short steps, and a dark wooden staff was held in his right hand, raised to shoulder level. When he reached the edge of the altar, he uttered a short phrase in Akkadian, pointing his staff toward the man with the athame. The man with the athame stopped, not by choice. His hand with the blade froze in midair, halfway through its movement toward the creature's forehead. He tried to continue, and Aberline could see the effort. The tension in his forearm, the trembling of his hand held by an invisible load inches from the target. The man with the athame was stopped, but not neutralized. He continued speaking, though his voice now sounded strained, like that of a man speaking into a strong wind. The guest couldn't maintain this state for long. Aberline realized this from the change in his guest's face. It paled. His cheekbones became more prominent and his breathing became audible. Maintaining the other's will required an effort of the same nature as the spell itself. Aberline's breath returned after 9 seconds. He stood up, holding onto the altar stand with his left hand, leaving his right hand free to wield the blade. The creature stood 2 steps away from him, facing the man with the athame, and did not move. The state of the unanchored spirit made its reactions unpredictable, but at the moment it was apparently waiting for the completion of the ritual, which was so close. On the creature's forehead were 3 lines of an unfinished seal. Aberline pulled a vial of holy water from his inner pocket. He opened it with his left hand, holding the stopper between his teeth. Then he dipped the tip of his blade into it, holding the vial horizontally to avoid spilling. The liquid coated the metal in an even film and didn't run off. It clung to the blade with the same tenacity as the dark liquid from the man's vessel with the athame. The creature stood sideways to him. Its forehead, with 3 unfinished lines, was 2.5 feet away, a sufficient distance. Aberline didn't waste time on further calculations. He raised the blade and drew it across the creature's forehead, covering all 3 marks with a single horizontal stroke. The contact of water with the dark liquid of the symbol produced an immediate reaction. 3 lines of seal flashed with a white light, identical to the one that filled the hall during the confrontation between the guest and the man with the athame. The flash lasted about half a second and was bright enough that Aberline lost the ability to distinguish objects in the hall for several seconds. He recorded the following. At the moment of the flash, the creature emitted a sound different from what I had heard before. Not a low-frequency resonance that affected internal organs. A high-pitched sound, unbearable to the ear, lasting for about 2 seconds and abruptly ending. After it ceased, there was complete silence in the hall. When his vision returned, Aberline saw the following. The creature was standing in the same place. The unsealed lines of the seal on its forehead had disappeared. The skin in that area was clear, as if nothing had ever been applied there. The reddish, then violet and white glow in the chest faded completely. The hall was illuminated only by the reddish coals in the brazier on the left wall. The creature did not move. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians lowered his staff. The man's hand with the athame was released from the force holding it and fell limply. The athame fell from his loosened grip and hit the floorboards. The man with the athame looked at the creature. For the first time, his face lost its composure. It took on an expression Aberline described as the understanding of a man witnessing the collapse of the only thing he believed in. The creature began to sag, not fall, sag, like a building sag when its foundations slowly crumble. First the knees bent, Then the shoulders gave way. Then the head dropped onto the chest. The seams on the body began to come apart, not abruptly, but gradually, like the threads of a worn fabric coming apart under its own weight. The dark liquid that had previously seeped through them was no longer visible. The interior was dry. The smell had changed. The sharp odor of sulfur began to fade, giving way to another, simpler, more final scent. The smell of organic matter returning to its natural state. Aberline described it bluntly. A smell of decomposition, growing rapidly, within seconds reaching a concentration incompatible with remaining in a confined space without respiratory protection. The constables near the walls began coughing and covering their faces with their sleeves. Several people retreated toward the gate. Aberline remained at the altar. The creature sank for about 30 seconds. By the end of this process, it was no longer standing. It lay on the floor at the base of the altar in a position that lacked the structural logic of a living body. The stitches had completely come apart. The components, previously held together by threads and apparently something else besides threads, began to lose their shape. Aberline did not describe this final process in detail. He wrote one sentence. What lay on the floor a minute after the glow faded bore no resemblance to a living creature, nor to what I had seen on the altar at the entrance to the building. The guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians dropped to one knee, not approaching what remained on the floor. He spoke a few words quietly, in Akkadian, then stood up and walked to the center of the room. The man with the athame remained motionless the entire time. He stood by the altar looking at the floor. The athame lay at his feet. When it was finished, he slowly raised his head and looked at Aberline. The inspector stood 3 yards away at that moment, a blade in his right hand. The man with the athame spoke in English. He informed Aberline that his name would be defended by people whose capabilities the inspector was unable to fully appreciate, that no court would accept the case as evidence, and that the only reasonable outcome for all present was the immediate cessation of the investigation. Aberline listened to him. Then he recited the formula of arrest in the name of the law and demanded that he follow him. The man with the athame looked at him for a few more seconds. Then his right hand rose to the left side of his throat, and he made one swift movement. Aberline reacted immediately, stepping forward, but it was too late. The man with the athame had gotten there first. He knelt by the altar and fell sideways. The athame blade, which he had snatched from the floor without Aberline noticing, remained in his hand. Constable Arnold, who entered the room with a flashlight a few seconds later, recorded that there was no pulse. Death had occurred instantly. A visitor from the Brotherhood of Guardians stood in the center of the room looking at the body. He said not a word of comment. Aberline wrote only this. The expression on his face as he looked at the dead man I would describe as neither surprise nor grief. Rather, it was a confirmation of what was expected. 7 of the 11 people who had entered the building remained alive in the hall. Constable Barnes was dead. Detective Moore was dead. Constable Harris is dead, with fractures incompatible with life. Constable Fletcher is unconscious against the right wall. With injuries he will survive, but which will permanently affect his ability to move. Aberline surveyed the room and recorded his final observation of the night in one short paragraph. The dark, leather-bound book was missing. The man with the athame held it as he entered the room and throughout his subsequent movements. No book was found on his body upon examination, nor was it found in any corner of the hall. A subsequent search of the entire building yielded no results. The book is not listed among the seized evidence. Dawn over the Thames that morning broke at 7:14. Aberline knew this for certain because he was checking his watch as the first gray light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows of Griffith's slaughterhouse. He had been in the building for 6 hours and 40 minutes without a break. During this time, he drew up a preliminary report of the scene, arranged for the removal of the bodies of the 3 victims, ordered the transport of the wounded Fletcher to the Royal London Hospital on Whitechapel Road, and personally searched every square yard of the hall for the dark, leather-bound book. The book was not found. Athame was. It lay where it had fallen, at the base of the altar, a few inches from the dead man's hand. Haberline picked it up in his gloved hand, wrapped it in canvas, and handed it to Constable Arnold with instructions to take it to Scotland Yard and register it as evidence under the description, "A knife of a ritual type found at the scene of the crime." No other description appeared in the official documents. What remained on the floor after the creature's disintegration required a separate solution. Haberline could not hand it over to the morgue with the standard accompanying documents. Any attempt at official classification would immediately raise questions to which there were no answers acceptable to official institutions. A guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians proposed a solution, which Haberline accepted without objection, recording only the fact of acceptance but not the details of its implementation. The guest has undertaken to organize the destruction of biological remains on site. I am not recording the destruction method in this document. I can confirm that by 8 o'clock in the morning on November 27, 1888, the floor of the hall was clear. The body of the man with the athame was another matter. Here, formal procedures were inevitable. A dead man with a slit throat required a report, a medical report, and identification. Haberline drew up the report. He put a dash in the identity of the deceased column and added the note, "Identification is delegated to higher management." It was the only such note in his entire professional archive over 20 years of service. The body was collected at 8:30 in the morning, not from Scotland Yard. Two men in civilian clothes arrived directly at the scene in an unmarked carriage. One of them had a letter which he presented to Haberline. The inspector read it, returned it, and did not detain the carriage. The contents of the letter are not included in the report. All that was mentioned was, the letter was sealed with a seal I recognized. I asked no further questions. The visitor from the Brotherhood of Guardians left the slaughterhouse at 8 o'clock in the morning. Before leaving, he stopped at the gate and addressed Haberline. He said the organization was satisfied with the outcome of the operation and that the inspector's personal actions would be noted in its internal records. Haberline thanked him and asked one question. Where had the spirit gone after leaving the vessel when the unsealed seal lines were destroyed? The guest answered. Haberline reproduced the response verbatim, unlike most of the guest's other statements, which were reported as paraphrases. He said this, back where he came from, but he knows the way now. That's the only thing that worries me about tonight. After that, the guest left. Haberline watched him until his figure disappeared into the morning mist over the Thames. Then he returned to the slaughterhouse and sat down on the only remaining chair against the left wall, next to the brazier, the embers of which had by now completely cooled. He sat there for about 20 minutes. Arnold, who remained in the building, later reported that the inspector hadn't moved or spoken during this period, but he didn't appear to have lost consciousness. He simply sat and stared straight ahead. Haberline then stood up, buttoned his coat, and began writing his report. Not at Scotland Yard, right here in the deserted slaughterhouse, on a board laid across his knees, in pencil, the ink in his pen having frozen overnight. He wrote non-stop for nearly 2 hours. Arnold stood by the gate looking out over the Thames. Neither of them spoke. In the report he wrote that morning, Haberline recounted in detail everything that had happened in the slaughterhouse from the moment the squad entered until dawn. Then he paused and wrote a separate paragraph, which in the declassified copy of the report was marked by archivists as the only section of the document containing a direct assessment rather than a protocol description. The ritual was interrupted. This is not the same as the ritual being stopped. An interrupted ritual leaves uncovered elements, used organs, cast spells, a partially applied seal. The treatise the performer used has disappeared. The body that conducted the parallel investigation and opposed the ritual is not an official state institution. The person behind this case is dead, but dead by choice and without a judicial verdict. All this means one thing. No question is closed. Only deferred ones exist. Below this paragraph follows a section that Haberline titled in the manuscript simply, personal. This is the only section of the report with a title. Its content takes up 3 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, Aberline listed the names of the 3 deceased: Constable Reginald Barnes, Detective John Moore, and Constable Thomas Harris. He listed each man's years of service, marital status, and number of children. Barnes was unmarried. Moore left behind a wife and 3 children. Harris left behind a widowed mother whom he supported. In the second paragraph, he wrote the following: The official version of the death of all 3 will be formulated as an accident in the line of duty. I cannot change this decision, since an alternative formulation would require explanations that cannot be included in the official documents. I can only record here in this report that the 3 men listed did not die as a result of an accident, that they acted with complete professional courage under conditions for which their training could not prepare them, and that their deaths were a direct consequence of an operation whose outcome was justified. There was one sentence in the third paragraph. Aberline wrote it and didn't cross it out, even though it didn't fit the formal style of the rest of the document. I don't know if this is enough. The report was submitted to Scotland Yard on November 28, 1888. The next day, it was seized. Aberline was informed that the document had been submitted for verification. Verification, according to the official register, continued until 1976. The athame, registered by Arnold as evidence, is listed in the Registry of Seized Evidence as of the date of its initial declassification. It is not listed in the Registry of subsequent years. The entry in the registry where it was listed is obscured with correction fluid in later copies of the document. The dark, leather-bound treatise was never found. Aberline left the slaughterhouse at 10:30 in the morning on November 27, 1888, climbed into a police carriage, and ordered himself driven home. Arnold, who was riding with him, later reported that the inspector stared out the window at the Thames the entire way and never looked away until the carriage turned off the embankment. What exactly he saw in the water, Arnold didn't know. The case was officially closed on December 7, 1888. Superintendent Arnold signed the document at 2:30 p.m. The wording in the closing protocol was 1 sentence long. The investigation has been suspended due to insufficient evidence to identify the suspect and bring charges. The word suspended was chosen deliberately instead of closed. The former left the legal possibility of resumption. The latter excluded it. Aberline was not involved in signing this document. His signature is missing from the closing protocol, and this absence has not been officially explained anywhere. That same day, December 7th, he wrote a report to the head of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department requesting a transfer to another station. The request was granted within a week. In January 1889, Aberline was reassigned to a position unrelated to homicide investigations. No official reason for the transfer is given in the surviving documents. The families of the victims received standard notifications. Constable Reginald Barnes was buried in St. Patrick's Cemetery in London on December 12, 1888. A 6-man police escort attended the funeral. Detective John Moore was also buried there on December 14th. His wife received a lump sum payment equal to the amount granted to families of officers killed in the line of duty in an accident. Constable Thomas Harris was buried in Stratford on December 15th. His mother applied for a survivor's pension, which was partially granted. Aberline attended all 3 funerals. This is recorded in his personal notes, which he kept alongside his official records and which were never submitted to Scotland Yard. The funeral records are short, with 1 or 2 sentences per page. On the page dated December 15th, after the description of Harris's funeral, the following is written: Mother stood up straight. She did not cry. After the service, she came to me and asked if Thomas had suffered. I told her no. It's not true, but there's no other answer to that question. Constable Arnold continued to serve at Scotland Yard until 1902. He never gave public evidence about the events in Wapping. An envelope marked November 1988 was discovered in his personal archive, donated by his family to the local historical foundation after his death in 1914. The envelope was sealed and opened by Foundation researchers in 1963. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a single sentence written in Arnold's handwriting. I heard it fall and didn't turn around. It was the right decision. I made it consciously. There was no further explanation for this sentence in the envelope. Detective Godley, who was involved in the Trovis Street ambush but was not part of the squad sent to the Wapping massacre, retired in 1896. In private correspondence, partly published by his grandson in 1951, one detail relevant to the matter is mentioned. In a letter to his brother written in 1901, Godley described the night of the ambush on Trovis Street without any details about the bullets stopping in midair or the figure vanishing into the wall. He wrote only this: "There was one night which I will not tell, not because I was forbidden, because there are no words that can accurately convey it, and inaccurate words are worse than silence." Constable Fletcher survived. The spinal injuries sustained when he hit the wall resulted in partial loss of mobility in his left leg. He was discharged from service for health reasons in March 1889 with minimal compensation. In 1902, he wrote a letter to Scotland Yard demanding a review of his compensation, arguing that his disability was incurred while performing his official duties, not due to illness. The letter was registered. According to archival records, the response was a refusal, citing the official wording of the case as an accident. Fletcher died in 1908. The local newspaper's obituary mentioned his police service in one line. The question of the identity of the man with the athame remained officially open throughout the entire period the case was considered suspended. In fact, it was never investigated. Aberline returned to this question several times in his personal notes over the following years. He never gave a name directly, but left enough indirect clues that several researchers who gained access to declassified materials after 1976 made identification attempts. The results of these attempts were not published by any of the researchers. Two of them, as far as is known, voluntarily discontinued their work on this topic. One explained his decision in a private conversation recorded by a colleague. He said he had found enough to understand that no more should be found. The visitor from the Brotherhood of Guardians never appeared again in official documents related to Aberline. But in the inspector's personal notes, he is mentioned twice after the events in Wapping. The first time was in January 1889, a brief entry about Aberline receiving a letter without a return address containing a single sentence in English. He repeated the phrase, "The treatise has appeared in Vienna. We're working on it." The guest is mentioned a second time in the entries from October 1893. Aberline writes that he met him by chance on the street, called him by his name, which he still doesn't recall, and the guest stopped. They exchanged a few words. The guest informed him that the treatise had been intercepted in Vienna in 1891 and was currently under the organization's control. Aberline asked him if it was under reliable control. The guest replied that it was as reliable as possible for an object of its nature. He then added that the question of the reliability of control over such objects is a question that each generation asks anew, and to which each generation receives an answer later than it should. After this, he said goodbye and left. Aberline wrote down the date, time, and place of the meeting with the meticulousness he maintained throughout his life. Then he added one line that appears nowhere else in his notes. He aged less than he should have in 5 years. Frederick George Aberline's official career ended in 1894. He retired at the age of 52, an early retirement by Scotland Yard standards. His pension documents list the reason as health reasons, but no medical records confirming any serious illness during this period remain. He lived another 32 years and died in 1926 at the age of 84. Scotland Yard's obituary described him as one of the most effective detective inspectors of the second half of the 19th century. The Jack the Ripper case is mentioned in the obituary in a single sentence. Inspector Aberline led the investigation into the Whitechapel murders, which was closed due to lack of evidence. The Ripper case is barely mentioned in the personal notes from his final years. Only once, in the entries of 1923, when Aberline was 81, did he return to it. The entry is brief and written in ink paler than in earlier documents. By then, his hand no longer held the pen with the same confidence. I sometimes wonder what exactly Boyer saw in room 13 on Miller's Court before he went out and stood against the wall. He never told me. I didn't ask. Some things are better left unexplained, just in the broad strokes. That's the only thing I learned from that case. Below this entry is a blank page. Aberline's report was partially declassified in 1976 as part of a planned review of the archive categories of Scotland Yard's restricted wing. The decision to partially declassify was made by a 3-person committee. The names of 2 of them are present in the accompanying documentation. The name of the 3rd is redacted. It was the 3rd member of the commission who insisted on the wording partial. 27 pages were removed from the returned package without explanation, and in the 87 remaining ones, several paragraphs were covered with a thick, black stripe. Among the redacted fragments, there's one that the archivists particularly noticed. It's on page 43 of the report, in the section devoted to the events after leaving the slaughterhouse. One line is redacted. The length of the deleted section suggests that the line contained between 8 and 12 words. The context of the surrounding text suggests that it was a name. Whose name it was, however, is impossible to determine. Among the 27 pages seized, according to the register, are the following sections. A full description of the biological remains of the creature after its disintegration. Details of the method of destroying these remains, organized by a guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians, and a closed appendix describing the nature of the death of Constable Barnes. All 3 sections have not been made publicly available, and, as of the last registry check, are still listed as particularly sensitive. This is what is known about the document's archival history. Now, let's look at what follows from its contents, if read in their entirety, without any edits. Jack the Ripper was not a surgeon. He was not a maniac in the clinical sense, nor was he a man acting under the influence of a mental disorder or personal pathology. The theories of revenge, sexual dysfunction, or medical experimentation that the investigative team developed in parallel with Aberline's investigation were theories that explained the superficial appearance of the crimes without addressing their internal logic. The internal logic was different. 5 women were killed in a strict sequence, as specified by the text of an 18th century BC Babylonian tablet. Their organs were removed in an order consistent with the ritualistic creation of a material vessel for an infernal spirit. The murder sites were chosen in advance and formed a geometric figure, which is an occult seal of summoning in a tradition rooted in the Sumerian civilization. The ritual's performer possessed knowledge and resources unavailable to the average criminal and belonged to the upper crust of British society in 1888. The ritual was interrupted. The creature created during its execution was neutralized. This is the only indisputable result of the operation carried out on November 26, 1888. Everything else remains open. The treatise known as the Picatrix, in its Babylonian source, which contains a section on the creation of fleshly vehicles, was intercepted in Vienna in 1891 by an organization whose representative was involved in the Wapping operation. According to the only source, Aberline's personal note from October 1893, the treaty was under the control of this organization by that time. Its subsequent fate is not reflected in any available document. The organization, known to Aberline by the working title The Brotherhood of Guardians, has not been identified. Attempts made after the partial declassification of the report to establish its connection with well-known occult societies of Victorian England, including the Order of the Golden Dawn, founded in 1888, and earlier Masonic structures, did not yield results that could be considered conclusive. The organization left no public trace. This in itself is an anomaly for any structure that has operated for decades. The spirit summoned during the ritual and departing the neutralized vessel on the night of November 26, 1888, according to a guest from the Brotherhood of Guardians, has returned to where it came from. The guest added that the spirit now knows the way. This statement is not a matter of record and cannot be verified by means available to an official investigation. It is presented here because it is included in Aberline's report, and Aberline's report is the primary source. The reader is free to evaluate this statement for themselves. The Whitechapel murders remain officially closed. The suspect has not been officially identified. No one has ever been held accountable for the deaths of the 5 women whose names appear in police reports in 1888. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. This circumstance is commonly attributed to the imperfections of Victorian police investigative methods and the inadequacy of the era's forensic science. The Aberline report offers a different explanation. The case was not publicly disclosed, not because the investigation had reached a dead end, but because disclosure would have required explanations that the official institutions of 1888 did not have the means to provide. This problem isn't specific to 1888. The final thing to note about Aberline's report concerns not its content, but its physical condition. The 87 returned pages are stored in a standard archival folder. The paper has yellowed uniformly, and the ink has faded to the degree expected for a document of its age. Everything is in order, except for one detail, which the archivists recorded in the accompanying sheet upon declassification, and which was not explained in any subsequent correspondence. On page 32 of the report, where Aberline first wrote down the question of what the person needed the removed organs for, and left his sole conclusion, presumably the organs are removed for use, the paper has an anomaly. Not a stain, not a tear, not a water stain. An anomaly, precisely. A patch approximately 2 by 2 inches, located in the lower right corner of the page where the paper is noticeably warmer to the touch than the rest of the sheet. Archivists measured the temperature with a standard thermometer on the day of declassification. The difference with the ambient temperature was about 3 degrees Celsius. They recorded this observation in the accompanying sheet and did not comment on it. The sheet is still stored in the folder. The temperature difference, as far as is known, persists. No one has officially explained why.